Cool. Well, I'm going to introduce you before you come up.
Okay,
all
great,
right?
fine.
So
It's very formal.
Just like in rehearsal, remember, Aaron?
All right.
That's how we roll. Okay. All right, cool. Very cool. So as you guys know, Aaron Levie is the CEO of Box. He dropped out of college to do Box back in 2005. I was very fortunate to get to work with him and his team a couple years later and had a lot of fun, probably my most fun product consulting engagement. And as you know, they IPO'd in 2015. So he's basically followed the same path as Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg. So he's one of the sharpest, huh?
Which version of Steve Jobs?
Yeah, right, yeah. Well, right now you're the young one with the pictures, and then later we'll get the.
Next.
Yeah, right, exactly. So he's one of the sharpest people I know, and if you haven't read his tweets, he's also one of the wittiest. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Aaron Levie. All right, bro. Great, cool. So for those people out there that don't know, it's a pretty incredible story. Can you just kind of share the story of Box and how it got started?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
So we got the idea for Box in 2004, and if you remember 2004, it was sort of, it was a weird time on the internet. Probably most of this room just worked at Yahoo or were in college. Like there were only like two places it could be. So basically, 2004 was in college, our sophomore year of college, and I had an internship at the time at Paramount Pictures in LA, and was in school, running around doing a lot of stuff, and in internship, kind of working a bunch, and in both of those environments, kind of ran into this problem of it was unnecessarily hard to share files and to be able to work with data. So in school, you'd email yourself files, you'd use USB thumb drives, you'd set up FTP accounts to be able to move data, and then at work, I used Lotus Notes at the time, and in sort of both environments, it felt unnecessarily hard to just get work done and be able to access files from anywhere. So did a school project where I studied the space, and at the time, there weren't a lot of companies that would let you just store your data online. There were a couple that sort of existed in the late 90s, and they had kind of died out. And so we kind of got this idea where if you took the cost of computing, and that was dropping pretty rapidly, browsers were starting to get sort of faster and better with the emergence of Firefox, and internet bandwidth started to improve pretty dramatically. And so we had this idea, well, what if we just now could finally efficiently store data in one place and then create a simple application to let people access their files from anywhere. So now, obviously, that's a pretty obvious idea, but back in 2004, we were fortunate that there wasn't that much competition. It wasn't as busy of a landscape as it is today. So we wrote the very initial application. It was called Box.net, very simple idea. You could pay $2.99 per month, and you got a gigabyte of storage. So we launched this, and all of a sudden, people just started signing up. And it turned out that we kind of struck a chord, and a lot of other people had this need to be able to store and access their files from anywhere. And so that was about 1/40 of the story. So
yeah.
do you want that level of granularity, or should we?
Okay. I mean, there's also some cool stuff about like you were in a garage at one point.
We were in a garage.
Right?
Okay,
so,
should we talk about the garage?
Sure, talk about
okay,
the garage.
So
it's like Steve Jobs,
there has to have been a point where there's some garage related to your story
exactly.
in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
So we too have our garage. So we got this email from, we emailed Mark Cuban, and he responded saying, hey, would you be interested in some investment? And we weren't even pitching Mark. He just kind of came out of the blue and decided to propose investing. And so he ended up writing a check for about $300,000 when we were still in college. And we were like, holy crap, like if Mark Cuban is funding this thing, maybe that's sort of more legitimate than we even realized. And so sort of by proxy, Mark Cuban's interest sort of led us to take it more seriously. We dropped out of college, moved to a garage that was renovated as a sort of live-work space. I don't think it was zoned as residential, so it's probably illegal that we were living there. But we were living out of this garage. It was myself and three of our co-founders that had all dropped out of college. And we just were testing lots and lots of different business models. Like literally every single day we would wake up or at least stay up really late and come up with a completely different business model. So we probably had about 200 different ideas of how we were going to monetize and build the service in the first sort of year and a half or so. We eventually moved to Palo Alto, obviously ran into you, and we're constantly iterating on our strategies and what did we want to become. and then ultimately pivoted and focused 100% on the enterprise market, which is where we are today.
Yeah, so that, I mean, you started out consumer in a lot of storage places, like you send it and started out consumer. So do you want to talk a little bit? Can you talk a little bit more about the pivot and how you decided to do that?
Yeah, so we it probably took a little bit too long. So it took us, I don't know. I like to say that it was relatively straightforward. I think if that's definitely revisionist history. I think it was delaying it for as long as possible. We were 22 and 23 at the time, and like literally the worst thing you could have told me at that age was you're going to build an enterprise software company. Like there's literally there's not there wouldn't
Sexy
be
job.
Yeah,
Sexy
there's
job.
not like a worse career path that I could have imagined is building an enterprise software company. So, no offense, but I mean I'm in it now. So we were 22, 23, and we had dropped out of college because we had this like grand, ambitious vision of like consumer storage for the masses. Everybody would be able to put their files online and be able to get to them from anywhere, and that was the kind of root of the basis of the company. But what we realized, I mean, it was like very basic. Like if we had just even maybe had one more semester of business school, we would have understood this. But on the consumer side of the market, you could see some pretty dramatic headwinds where the cost of storage was going to continue to drop precipitously, which would mean that big companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, would just give you the storage for free as a consumer, and then they want your data and they can mine it and monetize it. Conversely, on the enterprise side, which was a market we hadn't really kind of identified, but what was happening was end users were bringing Box into the enterprise as a simple way to share files, as opposed to using products like Microsoft SharePoint or Lotus Notes or traditional kind of document management software. And so there was this entire market that was literally like maybe 2 orders of magnitude larger than the consumer space, maybe 3, that we didn't even identify as a market, but that we were kind of being pulled into. And so it took us maybe, I don't know, 6+ months to fully get around this idea that what if we were the kind of disruptive technology to traditional document management software and collaboration technology. And so right around kind of late 2000, about mid 2007 is when we sort of decided to move all of our energy from being a consumer just primarily focused on sort of the personal use cases company to still being focused on the end user, but going after the enterprise. And there was a juncture, and again, it kind of took a little while, so it wasn't like the overnight epiphany. Like I had to be convinced by my co-founder, a couple of the co-founders many, many times that this was the right direction to go in. But what we kind of landed on was, okay, if we're going to do enterprise, then we're going to at least do it with hopefully as much of the sort of ethos of a consumer company as possible. So we sort of listed out all of the things that we thought sucked about enterprise technology. And we sort of said, what if we did the opposite of all of those things? So, nobody.
George Costanza strategy.
Yeah. So that was basically that was sort of the idea was what if we said, okay, how do you do customer service differently than traditional enterprise software? How do you build customers so it's utilization based as opposed to they have to buy the whole thing up front? How do you make it end user driven as opposed to make it so you have to buy the whole thing before you even see if it works for you? How do you make it consumer driven so the user experience is much more consumer like? How do you drive constant innovation and kind of continuous innovation as opposed to sort of these 2 or 3 year product cycles that you tend to get in enterprise software? So we had a list of maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 different things that we said, this is what we think will define the modern cloud era enterprise software company, and it will resemble much more of a consumer company than an enterprise company, but it will sell to enterprises. And that was a sort of decision that we made in 2007, and then from that point forward, the past decade, we've been 100% focused on selling to the enterprise, but effectively 100% focused on delivering value for the end user and the actual employees of the organization, the people that we ultimately tried to build the product for in the first place, just aimed at enterprise use cases.
Cool, yeah, and I know that, I remember when I was there, there was like rumors that Google was working on something.
Yeah.
G Drive was coming.
G-Drive.
So there was like this looming threat. Like,
any ex-Googlers in here? Okay, you really ruined a couple of years of my life, so just FYI, you're the reason I have like extreme PTSD on any kind of competitive thing. So
yeah, how did you deal with that? I mean, I remember you guys were worried about it. It was like nothing you could. Like,
nothing you could do.
Either going to do it or they're not.
Yeah,
like, how do you deal with that situation?
No offense, guys. It was like the worst things you could do. So like basically, what would happen was like Wall Street Journal would report on this product called Platypus or Lighthouse, which was the code name for Google Drive, and it just stalled the market for like 4 years. Like I couldn't get any funding. It was like unbelievably bad. So it was, but I mean, maybe in, I guess, I don't know, I'm having a real-time thought on this one. Maybe it was a good thing, because it sort of forced us much more quickly to have to pivot the company. So actually, I think everybody from Google, thank you. So,
yeah, exactly.
Because maybe we would have prolonged
the consumer side,
to the point where actually, wow. All right, great. Thanks, Google.
There you go.
All right,
cool.
So we were just dealing with this onslaught of competition from the big incumbents, and you had three kind of categories of competitors. You had sort of the traditional enterprise sort of storage and infrastructure players, so the hardware guys, so EMC, NetApp, et cetera. Then you had the enterprise software companies like Microsoft and Documentum, and then you had the consumer companies that were kind of bleeding in to the enterprise. And very busy landscape. I mean, much of that competitive landscape still exists today. And what we had to identify early on were, like, what are the things that we think are going to be distinctly our advantages? And a lot of this, there's a really, really good book that I'm obsessed with called 7 Powers. You have to read this book if you're in product management. It's a really great book, and it sort of diagnoses the sort of 7 competitive advantages that you can build up over time. And it's all of the things that we already kind of know instinctively, but it kind of categorizes them very nicely. And so the ultimate sort of advantage that I think we built in very early on were probably a couple where one was the sort of pure disruption angle, which is kind of Clay Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma. We were just literally 10 times cheaper, and we were impossible for the incumbents to respond to because of just our cost basis and our architecture. Like, we could just deliver our service at a much lower cost than what SharePoint or traditional software is going to be sold for. So one was just anytime you can find yourself delivering something at a 10x cheaper way than your competitor, that's a really, really good starting point to have. The other was we sort of balanced the consumer user experience with the enterprise capabilities in a way that no incumbent really could. That was based on just from the product managers that we hired early on, to the designers that we hired, to just how we thought about delivering the service. I'd say those 2 things are probably most fundamental in the early stages, was have a disruptive business model and make sure that we're doing something that literally the DNA of our incumbents can't respond to. Like, they just don't have the wherewithal to compete with a company that sort of blends consumer and enterprise in the way that we did. And those were 2 early lessons that we've largely taken with us to this day.
Cool. I think I've heard you call it asymmetries, right?
Asymmetries, yes.
Asymmetric warfare.
You want to have, unfortunately, it gets pretty brutal, so you do want to have some asymmetric advantages. And whether it's business model or talent or your underlying processes within the organization, you better make sure that you have something that literally competitors can't respond to because of their business model or technology architecture.
Cool. Well, I know you recently gave a talk at Stanford. You shared some awesome nuggets of product wisdom. I thought those were the nuggets. You just showed me the real long list. So maybe we can share some. I know, we can't give away.
We have secret nuggets, and then
exactly. So maybe you can share nuggets. What's one of the top nuggets would be good to share with the product leaders here.
Oh man, I don't know. There's a few different things that we sort of think about depending on the kind of stage of company that you're at. I mean, the stuff. So we did this talk about. All the little kids that are building enterprise software companies at Stanford, which there's like 3. So they have not been convinced yet that this is an exciting space. So we're working on it. But took some kind of lessons of how we got to where we are. I mean, I think the things that are probably most that remain top of mind is, and the things that we benefited from, we got really, really lucky without even knowing it, and we built something that was 10 times simpler than the incumbent technologies in the space. And I think it's so hard because if I had actually known what I know now about our category of technology and I went to go design a product, our initial product would be 10 times more complex than what we started with. And that would not have been disruptive. And that would not have
feature scope, right?
Features everywhere. And we would have had buttons going into buttons and into modals of drop downs. And so we were so fortunate that we knew nothing about the category we were disrupting, because it just caused us to think, like, what is the actual problem that the human has, and how do we just solve that, as opposed to thinking through compliance and privacy and workflow and all of the different shit that we all have to deal with all day long as we're building products, especially if you're in the enterprise. And that lesson was basically, and we were literally kind of considered to be a toy by the competitive landscape, and we were called out as completely deficient of the features that an enterprise would need to be able to share files or manage their content. And yet that was the only way that we could be disruptive to the category. And so, you know, I think there's probably rarely a product that any of us are building that that couldn't remove a significant, you know, chunk of the sort of functionality or things that sort of show up to the user. And so the first question you have to ask yourself is like, is what you're building overkill to the problem that you're solving? And is there a better way to kind of create a wedge into a user base that then you expand from, especially early stage? I mean, you see a lot of early stage products that are insanely feature rich, and it's just, it will never be disruptive because it's trying to be more comprehensive than the incumbent as opposed to simpler and just focusing on the bare minimum things that the incumbents weren't responding to. And so in I can say this in retrospect, again, we didn't know it at the time, but has anybody ever used this product called Microsoft SharePoint? Oh, okay, great. Wow, is everybody here like ex-Microsoft or something? So, okay, so SharePoint.
You want to thank Microsoft too?
Yeah, actually, thank you for building that. So, so SharePoint is sort of the classic disruptive case because what happened was over about a 15-year period, it just became more and more feature rich, and it just solved more and more problems. It started out as this basic sort of document management service, file storage service, and then it said, okay, let's do content management, and then it said, let's do workflow, and then it said, let's do website content management, and then let's do extranets, and then let's do intranets, and then it became a complete application development platform, and all of a sudden, you can solve literally like world hunger with SharePoint. Yeah. The problem is, you can't share files anymore.
Right.
Because all of those things that they built out ended up effectively making the end user experience completely encumbered with all of this functionality. And we got really lucky because right at the time where SharePoint was vastly more powerful than what most people needed, you had the rise of mobile devices, you had the rise of just more and more sort of like constant sharing and collaboration, and that one use case that they started with now was actually 10 times more important to the world, but it had been sort of drowned out by all of these other things that they were building up to be able to sell to larger and larger and more complex enterprises. So we got lucky because what we did was we just peeled off the most important part of that functionality and did it in a vastly simpler way, and that was the base of then our platform effectively. And we were fortunate because we got to learn their lesson, so we haven't sort of gone down that same path and repeated that same mistake. We'll probably make other mistakes, but ultimately, by sort of taking advantage of the thing that they weren't paying attention to that was yet most important to end users, ended up being sort of our disruptive advantage. So find that wedge, which is the thing that the incumbent isn't paying attention to, but yet is becoming increasingly important, is sort of one of the biggest lessons that we've learned. I think there's a lot of lessons that, at least in our space in particular, around living at the intersection of consumer and enterprise, that tends to be really, really important, especially when you have so many enterprises that are asking for just more and more complex features, and they want privacy and security and compliance and international data residency and lots of audit logs, and all of that can truly wear down your entire product or engineering organization if you don't think about it and do it properly. And so there's just a whole bunch of things over the years that we've had to learn around how do you build consumer-grade software for the enterprise, and how do you keep the discipline that usually is so easy to compromise on when that big sort of $2 or $3 or $5 million deal comes in from sales, and it's that moment of truth, which is like, it literally is like this big moral quandary, which is like, you can go win that deal, which it'll fund the company for like the next 2 years, and by saying no, you're going to get like the entire sales team incredibly pissed off at you. Yeah. But if you build it, it will fundamentally alter the entire course of your company, because that will become the foundation of a completely different product strategy, or it will encumber the user experience, or now you'll have a massive amount of legacy tech debt that you're going to have to maintain forever from some set of specialized customers. We've all dealt with that. And it's those moments of truth ultimately where you really have to be insanely clear on your North Star and have the discipline to either say no to those things or find a way to get the customer to feel like they are getting what they want without you having to then alter the fundamentals of that strategy. And that's like real jujitsu of the situation. And I don't think we've perfected it, but we've gotten lucky at many times where we've been able to actually kind of harness the energy from the customer and turn around a big major ask that would have been fundamentally disruptive to us and turn it into something that we could then go out and deploy in a way that sort of is aligned to our strategy. But then there's also been times where we've left tens of millions of dollars on the table over the years by saying no to functionality that we just felt like instinctively was not going to be the right thing to build for the long run. And it's that discipline that is incredibly hard.
Yeah, and it's tough. I mean, a lot of you guys probably, I was just talking about this in my workshop, is like sales is out there, they're going to say yes to any request, right? And if you're in the head of product, and so what advice do you have for these guys?
There was like uncomfortable laughter about 30% of the room.
Most of my PM humor is like funny but sad.
Yeah.
You know?
It's like just traumatic.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get practical. What advice, if you're the product for these guys, if the sales team's coming and saying, they're going to write a big check, we got to say yes. Like, what are some tips or advice you have on how to get them to stay focused on North Star and be able to say no, which is the definition?
I think you have to be in the room with the customer. I think you have to, the good news is, and we're really lucky right now for anybody who's building enterprise software, because in 2017, I do fundamentally believe the right customers to sell to are the ones that are willing to recognize that this is a journey in software and in the cloud era, where the right customers that you want to have are the ones that recognize that the legacy way of sort of sending out the RFP, the vendor builds exactly what's in the RFP, and then they just get it shipped to them. That's the wrong way to build software today in the enterprise. We are all, if you're in the enterprise, we are services companies. We're not sort of package software and send it to the customer companies. So now, you have to be able to bridge the customer's sort of tendencies and buying behaviors and relationship with vendors that they once had to this new way of working. And I think that requires not just the sales team to be consultative, but the product team to be consultative. We have to be in the room with the customer and understand their needs, understand their requirements, but don't just build to those needs or requirements. Build a solution that can get them what they are asking for, but not what they're sort of, not in the way that they're asking for. And that's, and honestly, it's so easy to say because it's like this is literally like how you'd abstract it out as advice, and it's either incredibly hard to actually maintain the discipline to do, and also it's not going to work all the time. And in the times where it doesn't work, where you try 50 times to convince the customer in a thoughtful way where they feel like again they're getting what they want, and if they still say no, then that's the moment of truth. And again, we have had to say no to that customer many, many times, and we've lost many deals. Now, the customers that we have wanted to work with and the customers that have really pushed our limits are the ones where they gave in a little bit and we gave in a little bit. We ended up with a better solution, usually a solution we didn't initially identify. They got what they wanted ultimately, and in fact, it actually created a better relationship with them in the process because they felt like, okay, this is a real partnership with this cloud company as opposed to, the traditional vendor model of they just ship me the technology. And so we all have an opportunity to build better relationships with some of these more complex customers and really kind of get to what is the, I mean, this is just your classic kind of Clay Christensen again of what is the job that they're hiring us to do? And if you build exactly what they're asking for, then you might not actually even be building for what the job is. And in our world, just to make this practical, the job that the customer hires Box to do is to help their employees be able to share their information in a secure way. A lot of times, the requests that they'll have actually are contradictory to the job that they're hiring us for. And so if we can help the customer sort of bridge those two things and help them recognize that you've hired us to help employees be productive and share, this requirement will actually impair that, which will mean that you don't get the value that you're looking for, and thus you won't actually use our software. Then all of a sudden, light bulbs go off, and we can actually get to a better sort of solution with the customer. But you have to have a shared goal that you both agree on, even if you're going to be coming from slightly different perspectives. So that's number one. You also obviously have to make sure that leadership is willing to make the trade-offs in the right areas. And obviously, depending on where the kind of influence or power is in some of these decisions, sometimes you do go down a path where it tends to be more sales-led, and sales-led by definition doesn't mean that it's going to be just driven by the RFP, but it does mean that there's slight differences in incentives that you want to be very thoughtful of, and that's what we kind of contend with all day long in our organization.
All right, cool. Were you just telling me? I mean, back in the day, we were all fit in one room, and now we have 1,600 people at Box. So, and you've IPO'd, and as companies get larger, it can be a challenge to stay innovative.
Yeah.
We were talking the other day. I don't know how many of you guys read Jeff Bezos' shareholder letter. He talked about day 2 versus day 1. Great stuff. So how do you tackle that at Box? How do you stay innovative there?
Yeah. So I think it's always a work in progress. I'm not at Jeff Bezosian levels of like imparting like sage advice on this issue.
I saw the list.
Yeah, okay, it's a good list. I think you saw me run through the list. I don't think you saw the words. They could have been just like nonsense. So, but these are the nuggets. So
it was actually just a Facebook feed. But
I think so. I was just showing my Twitter feed. You know, one of the challenges that you have, obviously, going public is we now have a whole bunch of external shareholders. You have Wall Street. Wall Street wants predictability, as they probably should, and so we have to deliver a certain amount of predictability. And so when you have predictability as one of the goals, you know, from you know the sort of one of the biggest external constituents that sort of we depend on, you have this risk of that can sort of seep into the organization in very sort of small but pernicious ways, where all of a sudden the planning process of the organization starts to be really about being predictable as opposed to being sort of ambitious, where people, when they sign up for goals in the organization, they want to make sure they hit the goal because when we hit the goal, that's how we get, you know, sort of the market to understand what we're doing, and you don't want to sort of set up for a crazy goal, come in well under, and then have people sort of react pretty negatively. And so you have this sort of general set of kind of conservatism that can kind of creep into the organization if you're not careful. And so we run this, and this is sort of, you could see this in spades within product, because when you're in product, like this is like every single dollar that you spend on engineering time and what we're going to go build is a trade-off. And it has to go into what you think, or what we all think, are the highest productivity areas of investment. And the challenge is, if you're a public company, some of those investments have to pay off in the near term. But if too many of those investments are just about the near term, then in 2 or 3 or 5 years from now, all you've done is push the problem down to the next product manager or the next team down the road that's going to have to deal with the fact that you didn't have those long-term investments. And so we run into this challenge, which is sort of, how do you allocate your investments? How do you allocate your energy? And how do you make decisions in a way where you can both deliver the predictable near-term results, as well as make sure that you're still doing some fundamental innovation that is going to sort of be your next act, or the next set of things that you want to go solve for. So what we try, again, haven't perfected, what we try and you know, think about and spend our time doing is, how do we make, you know, product decisions that are sort of well-informed by where we think the market's going, where we think the technology industry is going, what we think our customers are going to want, but not so conservative, not so driven by data that they sort of lose the essence of why you do product management in the first place. Like the whole point is, like, there's a reason that we're not just data analysts, that we're product managers, and that is because our job is to go make product decisions based on a set of influences that based on our judgment of where we think the world is going from a technology standpoint. And so it's all about sort of forcing that into the system that I tend to have to do, because it would be so easy to become so myopic around the data that you only start to make decisions once you reach some kind of threshold where, okay, 14% of our customer base is asking for this feature, and so we will just go build it. Well, what if only 1% of the customer base has identified that this is the future, and we want that 2-year head start when we go build it? So how do you go into all of the different kind of, you know, data points that are going to be out there, and make sure you're making the decisions that are going to be able to you know, actually drive innovation? And a lot of that can only be done on a qualitative basis, and that's where our own judgment comes into play. That's where our instinctive, you know, sort of decisions come into play. And a lot of my time is just making sure that we are trying to balance those big bets that are really meant for the long run with, you know, all the constant iteration and work that we have to do with just a large product.
Cool. And you just mentioned judgment. I know we talked about how early on you may not have a lot of data, you use more judgment,
right.
And as you get bigger, all of a sudden you have analytics and data out the wazoo. So can you talk a little bit about the role of judgment versus data in decision making?
Yeah, and this is just to clarify, this is not like a data science conference, right?
Sure, no.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
okay, so
yeah.
can I throw the data people under the bus? Or
sure,
no?
Yeah. Fiddler crab, remember?
Yeah. No, I mean, clearly, like, the perfect sort of way to do this is some harmonious combination of kind of data, judgment, and design, and so you get the three together, and obviously all powered by engineering. And you know, what I would personally, what I rely on, this is not necessarily true of all product managers, but what I rely on is sort of, you want to have pretty strong conviction about where you think the world is going and where your product should thus be going because of where the world is going. And it helps if you can be your best customer. So in our case, we just get to be our best customer because we live and work in our product, and we can just sort of see all the pain points and all the flaws. And this isn't true of every area in our product because we deal with a lot of companies that we don't necessarily have the highest degree of empathy for, like a pharma company. We have to respect their kind of requirements and needs as well. But in general, you should have very strong conviction about where the world's going, how you think your product should sort of play out at a pretty high level of granularity, a deep level of granularity, and then be able to make sort of calls on what to build, when to build it, but then use data to actually find out were those calls right, and how do you now need to iterate based on the calls that you made. So I would rather use judgment to decide what to build and use data to decide how to improve it and whether or not to shut it down or how to keep iterating and optimizing it than use data to tell us what to build. And that's a slight nuance, and it may be a meaningless nuance, but because you're lots of data's coming in lots of different forms. Like we have sort of a large basket of things that we generally know our customers want. But really, ultimately, like there's no perfect answer to what to build next. So you could either spend months and months belaboring and trying to figure out what to build next, or you can have a high degree of confidence and use judgment and actually sort of start cranking on that. And ultimately, I think our best decisions have been made when we just went with judgment. So very small example, super old school, but I think it's one that at least was an important inflection point for us, where we, and I think any product manager would have made the same decision, but when you think about it as a broader company, it's sort of like you feel like you have to justify it. But when the iPad first came out, we, I think everybody in this room was probably watching the keynote, live streamed at like 10 a.m. or whatever. We're all watching it. And basically, iPad came out, and within like about 2 or 3 hours, we were in a brainstorm session that we called to say, what is our iPad app going to look like? And as soon as we kind of had a rough sketch of what the iPad app would look like, we just said, OK, let's go put engineers on this. And this was like within the first day or two of after the brainstorm, we put engineers on the iPad to start to go and build it out. And I think it was like probably a few month window between sort of when the iPad was out. Or sorry, it was a few month window when it was announced to when the iPad's out in the App Store. And on day one of being able to download iPad apps, we were the only product in our market that would let you do sort of sharing and collaboration and content management on the iPad. And we had a lot of questions internally, like, well, how do we know how big this is going to be? And do we think that actually, professionals are going to be using it? And shouldn't we wait to see when people buy the iPad? And it was like, listen, if fucking Steve Jobs is betting his company on this device, like, don't you think like we could put like 2 engineers on this problem? Like it's Steve Jobs. It'll be okay. Yeah. It'll probably work out. And worst case scenario, we bet on Steve Jobs and it didn't work. So it was like all you really needed was like one proxy, which was like Steve Jobs has bet on this. Yeah. So you too can, right? So. And then guess what? Like, lo and behold, that was actually one of the most important inflection points for us as we were kind of scaling up, because all of a sudden executives in all of these old school enterprises went out and bought an iPad, and they were like, I can't get to my files from my iPad. So they started downloading Box, and they called up their IT person, and they said, hey, how do we get this for our company? And that was like one of our biggest drivers of growth from about 2010 to like 2013. And it was 2 engineers to build an iPad app, just based on no data other than this is probably the future, and if it's not, we're just betting on like the world's best product person of all time. Cool. So big deal.
So we have Apple to thank too then. Right?
Yeah. And so thank you if anybody here did the iPad.
And I know you're big on tailwinds. That's a pretty good tailwind, Steve Jobs.
It's a very good, and I think it points back to that, which is like you have to, like in our business as a startup, you have to make sure that like you have way more momentum kind of pushing you than things that are kind of pushing against you. And again, one of those sort of trite things, but like if you really kind of diagnose your business strategy, just make sure you have as many tailwinds as humanly possible. And for us, we've benefited every year from some new set of tailwinds, and we always try and make sure that we take something that could be either a headwind or neutral. If we can flip it into a tailwind, we try and do that. And so whether it's your technology architecture, whether it's the platforms that you're building on, whether it's again, asymmetric sort of advantages you can have against competition, whatever the kind of technology tailwind is in the market, just make sure you're riding that as much as possible.
Great. Well, awesome. Thanks for that awesome advice. Let's open up the audience Q&A here. Who's got a question? We're going to run the mics, so make sure you get a mic. Raise your hand if you have a question for Aaron. Laura has a question.
I don't need mic, I guess.
Okay. Well, she's coming. We can repeat it, too. Go ahead.
Okay. So same question I had asked earlier today. Do you feel that to keep innovation going on stuff that is for the future, that you need to have a separate team that is working on those future projects that's separate from your regular product team?
I'm probably not in the best position to answer that because I think it has to do with the point in time you are in as a company. And so if you were like Ford, maybe that would make sense because there's just so much sort of, you have such an incumbent position and incumbent and sort of existing processes and business that I would say if they want to build a self-driving, autonomous, which is redundant, on-demand, sort of ride-sharing thing, you probably want to build that separate and have them kind of compete against the Ford mothership. For a company of our stage, I think that everything about our product should be changing so frequently that it would be very strange if we kind of had to separate things just at our scale. So it has to do probably more with where you are in the growth curve and whether or not you are having to truly disrupt yourself versus have multiple sort of just step functions of innovation on top of what you've done.
I'm sorry, let me clarify.
Oh,
it's an earlier stage, but it's a situation where you have so many requests from your big customers that it's hard to get the more visionary pieces done because the team is pulled into, you need to deliver because these are all critical customers. So it's in that early stage.
Well, that's really tough. Well, okay, good luck. I still would say ideally no, because I think you have the risk of fracturing your product. I think you have the risk of fracturing the customer story. I think that we have one example where we decided to build something sort of fully off stack, not because it was a sort of disruptor to us, but we just needed sheer velocity. But we still folded into the overall strategy, the overall team. It's not considered a separate sort of completely organization. But again, I think there's always nuances depending on your market and the product. So it so depends on the specifics of your situation.
Cool.
Hi, my name's Sophia. Fight on.
Hey.
I had a question. Earlier today, there have been discussions around, if you were brought in as a product leader and the founders, still running the company.
Oh my God! Don't do it.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you, what is the working relationship that you have with the product leaders at your company?
Very healthy. It's very healthy.
Let me jump in.
More details in that,
just to kind of qualify. So, like we talked about earlier, hey, there's sales CEOs, there's engineering CEOs, there's product CEOs. How would you characterize yourself?
I think I like my sort of my kind of home base is product and kind of design. Now, my bandwidth is spread across a lot of other things just because of just the different kind of needs of the business. But fundamentally, if there's one thing I could start and end my day with, it would be product. I sit with the product team. I sit right next to designers. They don't like that. But my world is sort of thinking through product and hopefully providing value to the product organization in that process. I think that depends on, so are these founders product founders? Or just any kind of founder? Because it really does depend on.
It's just more a general question. I'm just curious, like how you choose to work with your product leaders, and what's the contractual relationship understanding.
It's a very loose contract. So, but okay. I mean, the perfect world is you have to be as a founder very self-aware that you could create a lot of dysfunction within the product organization because your natural instinct is just to jump in and be like, move the button there. Add this feature here. Hey, I wrote the spec for you, by the way, and actually this is what we're building, so thank you. It's very natural to want to do that, and we have a Xbox product manager in the room who can keep me honest on anything I say on this front. But so it's very natural to want to do that. I would say I give myself like a C+ in maintaining that contract to not do that, because I just get so excited sometimes. But what you want to do is ideally, you want to be like an internal consultant. You want to be like just, hey, like I'm a person who has seen the history of where the company's been. I kind of have seen some pitfalls that we've done. I saw that feature that we tried to do 4 times. It's probably not going to work this time, but hey, if you have a different pitch of why it should work, let's talk about it. When I'm at my best, I'm just a helpful consultant, and I try and make sure that full accountability and sort of decision authority has to go down to the actual PM, because the challenge is all about accountability, right? If the founder is making the decisions, then you don't get to hold the product managers accountable, which means that then you really aren't managing anything other than, like, you don't have actual leverage as an organization. So I think if you're going to get great accountability, you have to make sure that people feel real ownership. That doesn't mean that you can't be incredibly deeply involved, but only in the capacity of hopefully providing advice or support or feedback or ideas, and separating the actual sort of pure decision authority from that. And then obviously hopefully not kind of drowning the team with ideas where they're just effectively just doing your bidding.
Cool. All right, we have time for one last question.
How,
That was good.
okay,
All right,
thanks.
cool.
Okay.
A+ on the.
Okay, all right.
I got a mic. Can I go?
Yeah.
Go for it. She who has the mic.
There you go. Hi, I'm Anita Gardine, CEO of Oniva. I've got an enterprise platform that I sell.
Oh, great.
How did you go about meeting those network security, privacy, accessibility requirements? My first customer is Microsoft, so meeting their
Oh,
standards.
gnarly.
But yeah, exactly. But if you pick up the next customer, there's not as much standardization as we might hope as we go global. So how did you approach that so that you could take on as many enterprises as you wanted?
Yeah, so there's you obviously, I mean, the sort of obvious thing would just be ideally build things in as horizontal and kind of modular of a way as possible. Ideally, as much as you can kind of write into software, as opposed to having a sort of manual process and intervention, is ideal. In a perfect world, anytime that you're serving enterprises, it's ideal to be able to kind of talk with like 5 or 10 enterprises to try and get shared requirements amongst them, so you can kind of sort of see where are the points of leverage. Because what you'll find is sometimes, again, if you get lucky, some enterprises will trade better, more depth in one area and less depth in another area, and they might not know that you can do that more depth because you've actually gotten 5 or 10 other customers to agree to that. And then you end up with a much better product than sort of, I'm going to solve all of the problems for one customer, and then you show up at a completely different customer in a completely different industry, and they want all of the things solved for just them, and you wake up 5 years later and you've got like Frankenstein security policies that just possibly can't actually create a cohesive experience. So when we're at our best, what we tend to do is sort of find the similarities amongst many customers and create solutions that can be shared across those. And hopefully it can either sort of have enough modularity or customization where it can show up to that one customer as being customized, but it's not actually like written into the technology or written into the software that it's kind of customized for them. We've been fortunate that if you look at like compliance as an example, one thing, if you're doing anything in super regulated industries, get a freaking great compliance person on the team that has sort of seen cloud compliance, because you could literally go and build compliance sort of one at a time, and then just basically screw your entire software development kind of life cycle. Or you can do things with a very thoughtful approach where it becomes much more scalable, much more high leverage. It doesn't sort of get in the way of the development team, and it can actually, in the process, sort of solve multiple industries' problems. I mean, there's a lot of, for as sort of different as many of the compliance requirements are and certifications are for different industries, there are a lot of shared things. And so if you can at least get ahead of that by building in the sort of shared requirements into the core of what you do, that's at least what we've tried to accomplish at many junctures.
Cool, awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Aaron. She was joining me in thanking
Thank you, Dan.
Aaron. Thanks, man. Awesome, bud. Cool.